Hey guys, before I get started on the lookup functions in Excel, I want to just quickly address the idea of cell locking. This is a concept I'll be talking about a lot with these functions, and it's really important that you understand it. Basically, it's the difference between having Excel point to relative locations on a worksheet and pointing to absolute locations on a worksheet. So what that means is that if I type in a formula into Excel as you normally would. So say for instance we type this cell here, A1 plus 1, we get back 2. Now if we apply that formula down the worksheet, it increments because it adds, it automatically decides that what you mean is a relative location for this formula. So what I mean by that is that, I typed in A1 plus 1, but when I dragged it down, Excel decided the next cell should be A2 plus 1, and then A3 plus 1. So each of these refer to the cell previously. The same thing happens if I drag to the left or right. If I add a number here and drag it over, Excel will automatically determine that what I mean to do is increment this cell reference so that this is referencing B, C, this column is referencing, the column E is referencing column D here, and going on out. So in most cases, in well over half the cases of Excel, this is very useful and it's exactly what you want, but occasionally it's exactly what you don't want. And with all the lookup functions, it's very important that you do not use that feature of Excel. So what we do with lookup instead is we use absolute reference, and that's just a matter of formula change. So instead of doing just the +1 syntax here, what you do is when you're typing in your formula and you're on the cell that you want to absolutely reference, that you don't want Excel to automatically change as you move the cell, as you move your formula around, you can just hit F4, and that adds $signs before both the letter and the number in the formula. And so now I went from having B1 to $B, $1. And then if I then do the same thing that I did over here, which is create my formula with it by adding 1 and then drag it down, you can see it doesn't increment the cell at all. And that's because the difference is here, again, just to remind you, as I go down A3, A4, A5, it automatically determines that's what I want to do. Over here, because I'm using this $ syntax, which is the absolute reference, as I go down, it just stays the same. It always references the same cell. So for all of our lookup cases, that's what we're going to want. By the way, this also happens if I drag this horizontally. It continues to correctly reference the same cell each time, even though I've dragged it over. So when I talk about locking cells, what I really just mean is I want you to make sure you press F4 when you're working on the formula. So quickly I want to talk to you about the lookup function and then tell you why it's not the right thing to use, and then talk to you about the VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP functions, which are far superior in my opinion. So the lookup function works like this. There's several different syntaxes that it can use. I'm going to use the one that's probably the most expandable. So you may see, if you actually get into this and you wind up getting workbooks from people, you might see some lookup functions done slightly differently than what I'm going to do, but what I'm going to do will give you everything you need to know if you ever want to use the function. But again, I don't recommend this function. I recommend two functions, which I'm going to show you in a minute. But before getting into them, I just want to make sure you're aware that this other function is out there, and also so you know what the pitfall is if you ever do end up using it. There's a really catastrophic issue with it. So here we have two lists of names, the same set of names except for one, one set of names contains a height and the other set contains an age. And what I'm going to do is use the lookup function to look up the name on one list from the other list, and then pull back the corresponding age and combine it into the sheet, into the section here where we have height. So this is just a goofy little sheet. Obviously, this would be easy to do on your own, without using a formula, but we'll do a couple of examples that are a little more complicated. But here's how it works. So the lookup function here, I'm going to add this column age. Now again, I want to pull in Jason and find him over here. So critical thing with the lookup function, which does not apply to the functions which I'm going to talk to you about in a minute, is that you have to have your data sorted. So whatever you're looking up has to be sorted by the thing you're looking up. So in this case, I'm going to pull age using the name, so from over here. So I need to make sure that this table is sorted by that name value. So here I'm just going to go through, and I think it already is, but I'm just going to confirm, do it. It was great. So now that that's sorted, I can go ahead and go through with this. So the lookup syntax looks like this. Use lookup, normal formula, and then you want to punch in the thing you're searching for, the thing you want to look up. That's the first value. The second thing you want to do is where you're looking for it. And just for this is where lookup has several different syntaxes. We're going to use the one that I'm going to show you, but you know, you may see it done in slightly other ways elsewhere. And the syntax I'm going to use here is you're just going to highlight the array of elements or the column of elements that has the thing you're trying to find. That's all. And then here's where you use the locking syntax that I was talking about. Then you hit F4. So you highlight the group of things you're looking for. You highlight you start with the thing you're looking for, then you highlight you stick in the formula. Next thing is the column of or row, but in this case the column of places where it'll look it up, and then you have to lock those cells. So the easiest way to do that is to hit F4. But if for some reason you have any issues, you have to make sure that there's a $sign before every letter and number in this second argument of the lookup function. Then do comma, and now we're going to say, okay, they call it the result vector here in this case. We want the thing that we want to return back that we looked up. So basically we highlight in this case the age, because that's what we want to pull back, and again we have to lock the cells in that second column by hitting F4 as well. And I have two sets of columns highlighted. So what I'm doing here is I'm looking up Jason in this column and then returning the corresponding value here. So you can't quite see it, but just hit enter here. So Jason is here, so we're gonna pull, it's gonna match on him, and then it's gonna pull back 31. Now I can go ahead and just run that on down, and you see it worked great. Even when we hit this point here where Perry does not line up with Patricia, it knew that and pulled Perry's data from here, and now we have Perry's age correct and Sam's age correct. So now I'm going to quickly show you why this function is not the best, and it's because of the fact that for reasons which are beyond me, the function uses an approximate match, and in our case as a journalist, that's just almost never useful. I think there's some circumstances where it's useful, but just 99% of the time you want exact matches. And I'll show you the catastrophic things that can result from this approximate match, and then I will show you the better solution. So here we're going to just go in the reverse direction. We're going to take this set of names and look up the height. Before we do that, remember we have to make sure that the data is sorted. It is. Now lookup function requires that. The functions I'm going to show you in a minute do not, but let's just for the sake of this example, we're sorting. Now I'm going to do the same thing but go in the other direction. Here I'm going to look up Jason over here in this list, and by the way, I should add, it doesn't matter whether Jason is all uppercase over here and all lowercase over here. It ignores case, but it does have to be spelled exactly the same way, and the numbers have to be exactly equal for this to work if you're using numbers instead of names or words. So now you've seen I highlighted the thing we're looking up. Remember, I have to lock those cells. I hit F4, and then we'll go here to the next, and we want to pull back the height, and we'll hit F4 again. So now we're looking Jason up in this list and returning whatever value is in this list. So that works really great for Jason, right? 4'9", there he is. Larry works great. Morgan works great. Patricia does not look so hot. And you know, I think it should be clear by just looking at this that Patricia does not have a height listed over here. There is no value for Patricia, and the person who is 5'6" is Morgan, not Patricia. Basically, what lookup is doing is it's incrementing through the alphabet and deciding that Patricia comes just after Morgan, and based on weird ordering, whatever, it decides that, well, the closest match that I'm going to pull is Morgan, so it returns the height for Morgan. That is really disastrously wrong. It works great for the rest of this, but if we weren't paying very close attention to this, and if we had, say, thousands and thousands of names, and we were using this syntax, we could very well end up with some pretty awful results. So, that would be a pretty massive correction if we say, there's really no way to tell from the results here that this is not a perfect match. I wouldn't know that other than the fact that I can see it. So, what do we do? I mean, what is the solution here? Excel has this weird function, it seems so great, and yet it has this pretty catastrophic flaw. Well, the function that we want to use instead for this case is called VLOOKUP. So it's like lookup but with a V at the beginning, and the V stands for vertical. So anyway, it's primarily the thing that you'll use instead of just the lookup function. If you ever, I cannot think of a circumstance where I would prefer the lookup function over the VLOOKUP function, but I wanted you to be familiar with it. So let's talk about what the VLOOKUP function works and see how it's slightly different. So here I'm going to enter a second column. We'll call it age 2, and we're going to use the VLOOKUP function instead of lookup function. So you remember with the lookup function, what we did is we selected the person's name, and then we did the thing we're looking up, and then we returned the next value we passed was the index of names that we wanted to look into, and then the next value we passed was the next column we passed was the value we wanted to return. Here we're going to do something very similar, but not quite exactly the same. So what we're going to do is we're going to do VLOOKUP, and just like with lookup, we pass it the thing we want to look up. But here's where it gets a little bit different. You see here it asks for something called a table array. Basically, what you do is you go to the data you're looking up, and you find where the column that has the information you're looking up is. So in this case, the column is this column with the names. You start there, and then you just start scrolling over until, in this case, we only really care about the first 2 columns, but I'll show you slightly different examples in a minute, until we capture all of the columns that we were ever possibly going to want to pull back reference to, and then bring them all in and store it in that second. We're going to stick it in that second argument there. It's important to see, though, think of this now as a numbered box, right? So this thing is down here. You get the dimensions. It's 6 rows and 2 columns. So we're going to use that fact in the next argument here. We're going to use that 2, and I'll show you why. So you can see the next argument says column index number. So it's saying, okay, the first column that you've highlighted here is the one you're using to look up JSON with. Now, what column do you want me to return a value for? So, for instance, just as an example, I could type 1, and if I typed 1, it would just return back the name that it matched. For our purposes, we want to return 2, which is the second column, which is the age here. And here's where VLOOKUP saves us from that disastrous situation that we have with lookup. It actually lets us specify, do we want to have an approximate match, which is what lookup defaults and forces you to use, or do we want to have an exact match? Now, if I didn't specify this, VLOOKUP would also default to approximate match, which is terrible, but unlike lookup, I can actually say, no, I only want exact matches, and I'll show you in a second what that does. So now here we go. We're going to get exactly the same results as we got with lookup on this side, right? So just exactly what you'd expect. But here, when we do it on this side, you're going to see how it's going to save us from a potentially disastrous error. So we're going to use the same syntax here, VLOOKUP, and the name, and then we want to pull from these first 2 columns here. So we highlight the one that has we start with the column that has the thing we're looking up, and then we go over as much as we need. In this case, we only need to go over 1, and then we want to pull back the second column. Remember, always locking our cells. And then here we're going to hit, I'm going to do the false again to save us from that mistake. And fine, exactly what we thought we'd get, same results. And then there is where we got what we wanted to see. So that tells us, instead of giving back the incorrect response because it was close, it said that data, that record is not available. So Patricia doesn't have a record over here, so it comes back with a big error. And this actually is like an Excel error, so if these were numbers that I wanted to add up, Excel would not let me do that because it would say there's an error in those cells. So it's much, much more useful than lookup. So that's why I'm going to use VLOOKUP from here on out. And hope you don't mind. I know it's slightly more confusing syntax with all these numbers and falses and everything, but it is just superior. So anyway, let's look at a couple more examples quickly. So here's a quick example showing NFL football games for the year 2013. You can see that this example has no team names. Instead, we have something called team ID numbers, team 1 ID and team 2 ID, and then we have the scores. So we know that whoever team 1 is, they scored 37 points, and whoever team 2 is, they scored 49 points, but we don't know their names. In the next worksheet over, we have the names. We have the ID numbers and the names corresponding. So, the first record here, we see team ID is 31, so we could spend the rest of the day going back and forth and looking these up, and we see 31 is the Ravens. That would be crazy. So instead we're going to use VLOOKUP to pull back the records and stick them in here so that we have team names combined with scores, and we can get a much faster look at this. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to insert 2 columns. This will be team 1 name, and this will be team 2 name, and then we will do our VLOOKUP function. So before embarking on this VLOOKUP function, which is going to be a little bit longer or a little bit more arduous, simply because our data is split across 2 different worksheets. So in the first example that I showed you, everything was just neatly on one worksheet, and it was really easy to just look up different parts of the worksheet. More likely what you're going to get is you're going to get data spread across different worksheets or even across different workbooks. And so you need to be kind of ready to switch over to different worksheets in your formulas. It's really easy to do, but before doing that, I want you to sit, whenever you start this and actually try and do this, think about what keys you need to press to automatically just switch over to the next worksheet. And in my case, I think it's Control Page Down. I'm not sure. I think on Macs it'll be Command Page Down, and depending on your keyboard layout, you might have slightly different things. You can also use the mouse to do this, but when you're in the middle of typing a formula, I find it a lot easier just to use the keyboard. Anyway, so I'm gonna start this formula here. So I do my VLOOKUP, and now we want to pull the ID number. We want to look up the ID number, so we give it the ID number. And now, because we're using VLOOKUP, we don't have to worry about sorting, which is a nice thing. So unlike lookup, VLOOKUP doesn't care whether you've sorted the data. Now we have to pass it the table array. Now that's going to be the list of teams. So I'm going to use my keyboard shortcuts here to just switch over. And then you can see as I'm moving around on here that it's prefacing my section, automatically with that teams exclamation mark, which is just the worksheet's name followed by the same cell reference that I would normally have. So it's saying, here we are, we're in games, but we're looking into teams to pull back this information. I didn't really have to do anything other than just switch over using keyboard shortcut again. Once I've selected the data I want, I'm going to hit F4. Now in this case, it's pretty much the same as the last time. We are going to use 2 as the column number because we're looking up, we have the ID numbers, column number 1. We want to return the data in column number 2, so we do that there. And then as always, we type false because we only want exact matches. And that worked great. We got back the Baltimore Ravens just like we were supposed to. And we can go ahead and just apply that on down and get everybody's names. And then it's pretty easy to, in this case, just take this record, that formula, paste it on over there. The reason is that we have locked everything in here, so that's not going to change. And now we're just going from looking up this ID number to looking up this ID number. Everything else remains exactly the same. So now I can see all that stuff together, much easier on the eyes, much more convenient for you to look at. So we've now essentially joined the information from this list into this list using these ID numbers. Really important to just reiterate, the VLOOKUP function only works on exact matches. When we only want it to work on exact matches, but if you had 31.0000001 as the ID number here, which I'll just show you, if it was just almost the same but not quite, it's not going to match, so you're going to get back no result. So there's cases when you might be using VLOOKUP on floating point numbers, and you might get some issues there, so just keep that in mind. So now let's just look at VLOOKUP with a slightly more expansive example. Here we're going to take this list of just totally made up news events with 3 things that happened at some company that I just made up. And we have dates for these events, and we have little, whatever, news. And we want to know what was going on with the stock on those days. So we want to know the volume, we want to know the closing price of the stock, and we want to know how much had the price changed from the day before. So conveniently here we have on this next sheet that exact information, but not compiled according to these dates, and we have extra information we don't care about, and we want to pull back specifically what we're interested in. So what we're going to do is use the VLOOKUP function to take this date right here, and then this one, and then this one, and then look over here for the corresponding dates, and then pull back the information in these columns. So I think most of you can probably imagine how this is going to work, but just to show you, we're going to do VLOOKUP, and we take the date, and then we use that keyboard shortcut to switch over to the next cell, the next sheet, I mean. And now we look at this here, and I like to, do this kind of slowly here just for your example's sake. You can see the 5C. The first thing we want to get back is that volume. You can see is the 6th column, right? So the first thing I want to pull back when I writing my formula is going to be the 6th column, and then obviously, sorry about that, the next thing we're going to want to pull back is the 7th column, which is that closing price, and then the price change, which is the 8th column. So we're going to 6, 7, and 8. So pretty simple. I go ahead and highlight the whole thing. So I've gone all the way down to the bottom here. So there's all the way up to to today, I just hit F4 like I always do to lock my cells, and then I remember the first thing I'm going to pull back is that volume. So that's the 6th column. And then I always have to type false here. We don't want to get back something where it's like the date is close, but it's not the exact date. We want an error if that happens. Much prefer to see an error so we know, and then we can go look and say, why is there no volume on that date? Hit enter, and it brings me back to the sheet that I was working on, and just like that, it is filling out the volume. Now, I copied it on down, and it pulled back the volume. Now we want to also pull these next 2 columns. If you remember from my my last example here, we were just able to copy the formula over and paste it. It's not going to work in this case. Instead, we're going to have to make a little bit of changes. I copied it over and we got back this error. It's because it's trying to look up now. We didn't lock this cell, so it's saying, oh, I'm trying to look up this word over in that table, and it's just not going to work. So I'm just going to move this back over here, and we won't worry about locking it right now. And here, there's one other problem, though, with using this technique for this, and that is that now I'm looking up the correct date, but when I copy this over, Excel did not increment this column index number. So it's not saying, oh, now you want to look in column 7. It's still looking in column 6. I have to manually say, oh, actually now for this I want to get column 7. And then it looks up the price change. You can obviously come up with techniques to deal with that by like adding numbers up above and then pointing at that or something, but it's not really that big a deal. So anyway, we go ahead and paste these on down. Actually, yeah, we'll go ahead and do that. And then we can just go through that same kind of process with the next cell here. Just take it over. Again, we get back the error because it's trying to look this up. Now, another solution to this would have been to lock that cell, but I don't want to get too complicated on you guys. But that would be what I would do normally. Again, I have to change this number to 8 now. So you see this is, a little bit annoying, but it's really useful. Now I can see the information that I need, and if you just imagine for a second that you had a list of, say, 100 news events, and you wanted to get the average price change on these news events, well, now you've just come up with a really simple way to do it. It's just so useful. VLOOKUP, like I can't stress how useful of a function this is. I guess before I close you out here, I just want to talk for a quick second about the other function that does this sort of thing, which is HLOOKUP. HLOOKUP stands for horizontal lookup. So we've been focused primarily on vertical lookup, which basically means that it's looking up and down a list of things and then matching the one that matches and then pulling the column in that you want. If we do HLOOKUP, it means it's going to scan left to right on data and then pull down on the row that you specify. So it's the same exact process, it's just for a different orientation. Not too often is it practically that. It's not. I don't find myself using it that often because generally data is delivered more in this sort of format like this than in a wide format that HLOOKUP is designed for. But there are times, especially when you're doing something a little more fancy, when you may need to use it. So I'll just give you a quick example with this data that we already have here. Let's just get rid of this dummy stuff here, and we'll just take this. Now I'll just take these guys, and now I'm going to use a cool feature in Excel called transpose. So if you go to the paste menu and you see this icon or it says transpose, where you know the flips it, basically it flips the data, it transposes it so that now the columns are all rearranged, and now it's basically gone from being a 2 by whatever 7 box to a 7 by 2 box. So now we're going to use over here, we're going to take, and I'll just delete this and just not confuse you guys. So now we want to take this data and we want to find the corresponding values in with this data. So HLOOKUP works, like I said, almost exactly the same as VLOOKUP, except it's just slightly different. It's a different orientation. So when we punch in the table array, now instead of the first column like we were doing being the containing the record you're trying to look up, now it's the first row which has to contain the record you're trying to look up. So that's this row, and then you just go down until you include all the data you want. In this case it's pretty simple, it's just that. And then you, as always, lock your references by hitting F4. And then in this case now we want to type the row index number. So instead of the column index number, it's the row index number. In this case, 2 either way. 2, so it's the second row that we want to actually return data for. And then just like in VLOOKUP, if we don't want to get back approximate matches, which we almost never do, we use false. And now that gives us the age of these guys. So it's also just a handy way of moving data, like transposing it. So that pretty much covers the basics of the functions here. I just want to reiterate there is a basic function that you can use called lookup, but as we saw, it had some pretty serious drawbacks, the two of which in my opinion are that you have to sort the data you're looking up, and that it will return approximate matches when you don't necessarily want that, and there's no way to force it not to do that. The much more superior but slightly more arduous functions are HLOOKUP and VLOOKUP. The one you're going to use most of the time is VLOOKUP, and I think probably that covers it. So good luck.